If we could somehow travel back in time about 700 years to the mid-1300s, we'll notice something interesting. All the world's civilized societies, everywhere, were pretty much the same, except in the details. Even though languages, religious beliefs, and social customs were certainly different, often very different, still, all over the world, the vast majority of people were illiterate, poor, and deeply religious. Their rulers were hereditary and all-powerful. Women were treated more like property than human beings. Slavery in all its forms, chattel slavery, serfdom, indentured servitude, was everywhere, and human rights were unheard of and undreamed of. But Western society has changed pretty radically since then, while the rest of the world remained pretty much the same. Why and how? What made Western society change so radically, and why did only Western society change? Welcome to Depth History, where we talk about how the human condition created and creates the human condition. It's difficult for 21st century Westerners to imagine from our modern perspective what life was like back then, so many centuries ago, here in the West. Society was highly stratified. People were born into economic classes and social roles from which it was very difficult to escape. Their futures were pretty much set in stone from the moment of their birth. A tiny minority, the elite, controlled everything, and they exercised total political power. Most common people were illiterate, dirt poor, undernourished, and lived in crowded and unsanitary conditions. They were deeply religious, and their hopes were focused on the next life, whether they would end up in heaven or hell. The Christian religion was the source of all knowledge, all understanding, all morality, and could not be questioned. Its teachings were absolutely certain and could not be questioned. The church taught that the political and societal structure had been commanded by God and could not be questioned, and that it was forbidden for anyone to rise up against their masters, kings, aristocrats, fathers, or husbands, especially the church itself, no matter what their grievance. The church's power and influence penetrated every aspect of both public and private life. There were rules for everything, including the most intimate aspects of private life. A woman was not an independent human being, but the possession of some man, her father, brother, or the husband to whom her family had married her off, with or without her consent. Superstition, magic, and astrology were everywhere, and all kinds of superstitious rites accompanied life's important events: birth, marriage, death, the annual cycle of agricultural events, plowing, planting, reaping, etc. Slavery in all its forms, chattel slavery, serfdom, indentured servitude, was common, just as it had always been, and no one thought there was anything wrong with it. There was no private ownership of land. All the land, the most important productive asset at that time, was owned by the king, nobility, or by the church. There was no government safety net to rescue people who'd fallen on hard times. Only limited assistance from church institutions and voluntary associations such as guilds. Murder, robbery, and other violent crimes were common, and because there were no police, often went unpunished. Travel was especially dangerous. That's why cities had thick, high walls around them for protection, and the gates were closed every night. Epidemics, plagues, crop failures, famine, they happened all the time. Doctors were pretty useless, and in any case, very few people could afford them. People could be executed in the cruelest and most painful ways imaginable for the slightest of crimes: insulting the king or the church, heretical religious belief, stealing a horse or a sheep, hunting on a nobleman's estate, smuggling, and many other crimes. And execution was often preceded by torture. There were no impartial courts where the common people could demand justice against abuses by their so-called superiors. War was a constant threat. An invading army could appear without warning, out of nowhere. A person could lose everything and might even be carried off into slavery. And perhaps most importantly, nothing would ever change, or even needed to change, because as the church taught, life's sufferings had been decreed by God as punishment for man's original sin and for personal sins. Future generations would be exactly the same, only the cast of characters would change. Different people would move into the roles of rulers and ruled, oppressors and oppressed, rich and poor, exploiters and exploited, but the structure of society would forever remain the same until the coming of the Messianic age, when, as the Bible says, the meek will inherit the earth and delight in the abundance of peace. But not before then. A time traveler from the 1300s would find the modern West a very strange place, and would be absolutely baffled on discovering that there's been a sharp decline in religious belief and in the political power and influence of the church. There are no more blasphemy laws, and anyone can freely practice any religion or even no religion. Governments now declare that they work for the benefit of the people, rather than people working for the benefit of the government. There are now democratic elections, human rights are enshrined in law, and there is equality before the law without regard for race, gender, or religion. Women are no longer required to submit to authority simply because it's male authority. Slavery, which was once practiced in all societies, and no one thought there was anything wrong with it, except for the slaves, of course, has been abolished. Poverty has been greatly reduced, and there's now a relatively prosperous middle class. Anyone can aspire to any profession, regardless of the family he or she was born into. Anyone can acquire land, a house, and other productive assets. There's freedom of expression in speech and in print, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, and from government interference in people's thoughts and beliefs. Ancient sciences, especially astrology and magic, have been completely discredited and have been replaced by a materialistic, mechanical, mathematical science that has harnessed nature to human needs, especially in the field of medicine. Magic and astrology have become nothing more than entertainment. Magic is just a parlor trick, and horoscopes are just columns in the weekend newspaper. To whatever extent similar changes have since taken place in other societies, it's only because of Western influence, often imposed by force, not always successfully, and not always to the immediate benefit of those societies. But the West, like every other society in the world, has certainly not created utopia. Far from it. Let's not forget that in the so-called enlightened 20th century, the Western secular religions of fascism, Nazism, and communism killed between 82 million people, in addition to the tens of millions killed in the two world wars. Not that the world's so-called unenlightened non-Western societies have been any better when it comes to wars, massacres, and other atrocities. They've also engaged in all these horrors, but the massive death scale of the last century is an entirely Western phenomenon. So much has changed since the 1300s, but humanity's greatest faults, greed, hate, and man's general inhumanity to man, still haunt us. So how did the West go from a society that was pretty much the same, except in the details, as the world's other societies, to a society which is so much different from them? How did this massive, centuries-long transformation in outlook and values, in the West's fundamental beliefs about the nature of society, how and why did it come about? The reason that Western society was able to change so radically is that the foundations it rested on have always been a little shaky. It was uniquely vulnerable to change because its educated and privileged classes were exposed right from the beginning to two destructive influences. We'll go into these two destructive influences in detail in upcoming episodes, but for now we'll just mention them in brief. The first of these was classical learning, Roman and Greek, that is pagan culture. The West never completely rejected or abandoned its pagan roots in the way that Islam and Judaism did. The classical period, its texts, and the ideas they expressed were an unavoidable presence in all of Western Christendom, not least because these texts were used to teach Latin, the language of the Church. So in addition to the Christian revelation, a good Christian had a second legitimate source of wisdom and morality, the writings of non-Christians, pagan polytheists, who were, according to Christian doctrine, suffering in hell for all eternity. The second destructive influence was the Christian religion itself, and especially its representative on earth, the Church, which had over the centuries entrenched itself at every level of society, from humble village to royal court, while growing ever more wealthy and powerful, and was widely perceived as irredeemably corrupt at every level, morally, financially, and politically, from the Pope down. We'll note a few more points. First, the transformation of Western society was slow, with many wars, much bloodshed, and was massively destructive. Second, I have deliberately not used the word progress to describe the transformation. I absolutely believe that the modern West is a better place to live than the pre-modern West, but using the word progress would have implied that modern Western society was the goal of the transformation, but it most certainly was not anybody's goal. Far from it, very far from it. None of the writers, politicians, philosophers, or religious figures who over the centuries advocated change envisioned anything like modern Western society. As the English historian Herbert Butterfield wrote, if Protestants and Catholics of the 16th century could return to look at the 20th century, they would equally deplore this strange, mad, modern world. And as much as they fought one another, there is little doubt that they would be united in opposition to us, and Luther would confess that he had been wrong and wicked if it was by his doing that this liberty, this anarchy, had been let loose, while his enemies would be quick to say that this decline of religion was bound to be the result of a schism such as his. Join me in the next episodes, where we'll discuss in detail the two destructive foreign influences to which the West was exposed, and for later episodes, where we'll be examining individual changes like the abolition of slavery, the rise of religious skepticism and disbelief, human rights, and the emancipation of women, and more. By the way, if you enjoyed this video, please click the thumbs up icon, subscribe, and ring the bell so that you'll be notified of new videos as soon as they come out. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.